So, M103, the motion in the Canadian House of Commons to condemn Islamophobia and systemic racism, has passed. 201 to 91. I'm not going to discuss my issues with this motion in detail again here because I did a pretty thorough dissection of the motion in my videos on it before, so if you're interested in my full perspective on it, I would recommend that you watch those videos, which I will link here in a card. I've received a few questions from concerned viewers who are worried about the future of my channel, since just for criticizing and mocking Islam and the arguments for its truth, I'm called an Islamophobe on a regular basis. So let me clarify, you don't need to worry. I've been noticing a lot of misinformation floating around out there about M103, and in particular claims that it's a bill, and now that it's passed, also a law. And this is totally false. It's not a bill. And Islamophobia, whichever one of its myriad definitions that's taken to mean, is not illegal now. Criticizing Islam is not illegal. Even actual bigotry against Muslims is not illegal. So don't worry about that. M103 is basically just a big giant virtue signal from the government. It has absolutely no legal implication. And I have to ask anyone who, like me, opposed the motion and intends to oppose similar government actions in the future, please stick to the facts. I saw some people calling this a bill or a law, and whether they were doing that out of ignorance or out of an attempt to incite fear, it really wasn't helpful. It's not that hard to find this kind of information. It really only takes a small amount of research, and in the long term, it's going to be far more effective to understand the true nature of what the government is doing and oppose it on principle with all the facts on your side. I'm really glad that people are engaged in pushing back, but hyperbole and mischaracterization do nothing but make that opposition look like it's full of a bunch of loonies. But, as I said before, there are legitimate concerns. Although no change has occurred legally, some things have changed. By passing this motion, the federal government has endorsed the term Islamophobia free of any definition whatsoever, thus implicitly endorsing the wide variety of definitions which are commonly used, one of which is the mere criticism of the ideas of Islam. And the government has also declared a desire to eliminate a certain kind of thoughts from among the people of Canada, which to me indicates a very troubling perspective in our government on the concept of free thought and on what its own responsibilities are. I would argue that it's not a government's place to try to control the minds of the people, but rather the people's place to control the mind of the government. And furthermore, the government has endorsed the idea that systemic racism is a problem in Canada, again, without providing any definition or examples, thus lending its power and credibility to the overreaching social justice advocates who tend to use ideas like systemic racism as bludgeons against people of certain races. But most importantly, it's asked the Heritage Committee to perform a study on how to reduce or eliminate systemic racism, religious discrimination, and Islamophobia from Canadian society, and to provide recommendations within 240 days. And since we currently have no idea what those recommendations might be, that's something to be cautious about, since those recommendations could lead to real action to attempt to eliminate these ideas from among the people. The idea of eliminating an idea from a nation of 35 million people is beyond absurd, not to mention dangerous. And if that's truly the goal, it's not impossible that the recommendations could include, in typical euphemistic language, the production of pro-Islam propaganda by the government, or the creation of new speech laws to try to make people conform or submit to the government's opinion on Islam and Muslims. How else would a government eliminate an idea from a country? Now, to be clear, I don't assume that's going to happen. As a matter of fact, I would be mildly surprised if it did. And if my concern turns out to be totally unfounded, then I will be very happy. But I still see some wisdom in expecting the government to misbehave and keeping an eye on it in situations like these. Now, if you watched my previous video, you'll know that M103 was sparked by a petition signed by 70,000 Canadians called E411 Islam, which asked the government to condemn Islamophobia and pretty much call Islamic extremists no true Muslims. Well, now there's a petition opened on March 7th called Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which currently has over 27,000 signatures. And since it's open till July 5th, it'll probably get a lot more. And it concerns Sharia law. It seems like it was spawned directly from the creeping Sharia fear-mongering about M103. And look, before anyone comments, I get that M103 is a problem. I get that it could be the first step towards future problems in the ability of Canadians to criticize Islam as fully as any other idea. I've said as much already in this video. And whether the oblivious politicians realize it or not, by adopting the term Islamophobia with no definition, they have declared their opposition to the criticism of Islam, because that term is very commonly used that way in an attempt attempt to shut down criticism. And it's possible that in the future it will start to get more difficult to criticize Islam and Sharia openly. Not as a direct result of M103, but as a result of something else further down this path. But M103 itself is still a very far cry from the imposition of Sharia law or the allowance for separate Sharia courts. I would always advise vigilance against any whiff of theocratic thinking in the government, but I don't see any reason to start a Sharia panic about this. But when people express those kind of concerns, I can at least understand where they're coming from. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's read this petition. Whereas differential justice based on an individual's religion is prejudicial and preferential, therefore an amendment to the Constitution Act of 1982 would ease the minds of all Canadians and ensure equal treatment for everyone under the Criminal Code of Canada. We, the undersigned citizens of Canada, call upon the Government of Canada to propose an amendment to the Constitution Act of 1982 under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, stating that Sharia law or separate Sharia family courts will never have a place in the Canadian justice system. Okay, so it's asking for the integration of Sharia and Sharia family courts into the justice system to be made explicitly unconstitutional. Well, I absolutely agree with the sentiment. There's no place at all for any system of religious law in the Canadian justice system, or any separate courts of any kind. As far as I'm concerned, if you live in Canada, you use the same justice system everyone else uses, no exceptions. And that system should not give a damn about your religious preferences about how it should work. But I do have some issues with this. First, I have the same issue with this that I have with M103 and with E411. Specifically that it singles out one particular religion. In that case for special recognition, and in this case for special limitations. I understand that the Islamic religious law sucks, and that it's a popular issue these days, but I would much prefer that this petition specify that no religious law or religious courts of any kind have any place in the justice system. If you're gonna shoot for the moon and try to amend the Constitution, why would you do it in a way that might need to be changed again later when you're worried about some other religion? And I also don't know why they specified only family courts when it should include any courts. And last but not least, I'm pretty sure that because the Charter already requires equal treatment before and under the law, religious law and religious courts are already disallowed within the justice system. But if that were the only issue, I wouldn't really have a problem with this petition, because it would just be asking the government to make that more explicit, which is probably good. Not strictly necessary, but good. Now, having said all that, I think this is a really interesting response to M103, because it allows the supporters of M103 to be attacked with their own rhetoric. During the conflict about M103 and E411, we kept seeing this dishonest accusation of, what, do you want Islamophobia in Canada? Do you want hate crimes in Canada? And now that same accusation can be flipped around, and any M103 supporters who oppose amending the Constitution, or object to any wording in any proposed amendment, or who speak ill of the wording of the petition, will be asked, what, do you want Canada to be ruled by Sharia law? So, although I personally don't like the wording of the petition, I do find it to be a pretty clever troll. I'm curious to see how this plays out, because with at least 500 signatures, the government responds. And if they just shrug it off, imagine what's going to happen. It should be fun to see. And now for just a little bit of fun, let's watch Ikra Khalid struggle with reporters' questions after the passing of the motion. It's pretty great.
What do you think about the Prime Minister not being here for this vote and instead choosing to campaign? What does that tell you about your leader decides to skip a very important vote?
I'm really looking forward to this study being conducted by the Canadian Heritage Committee. It'll be a great time.
Well, you certainly can't say she lacks subtlety. You barely even noticed she dodged that question about the Prime Minister not bothering to show up to vote, did you? I bet your brain totally fooled you into thinking it was really a question about her opinion on the Heritage Committee study, right?
Do you ever think that you could have allayed the Conservatives' concerns by putting a definition of Islamophobia between a couple of commas in that motion? In the text?
I'm really looking forward to the committee making that
But you
conclusion.
haven't answered my question. Do you ever think you could have allayed their concerns by just
I don't think so, no.
Why not?
Any more questions?
Why won't you answer my question?
I'm interested in that answer.
Yeah, we want to know that. What was your question?
So why wouldn't you have felt that you could have allayed their concerns by just putting a definition in the text of the motion? Put it between a couple of commas?
You know, it was a really collaborative effort amongst all Canadians and amongst all parliamentarians, and I was not able to find consensus. And like I've said before,
in the text of the motion.
I think I've said before as well that, you know, a lot of grassroots organizations came forward, a lot of MPs came forward and consulted with me on this motion and really changing the words of the motion, to which so many Canadians and members of Parliament were standing for. It just didn't make any sense. So I'm really happy that the vote today has shown positive support for this motion, and I'm really looking forward to the committee taking on this study.
I just had to play that in full so you could see the full scope of her struggling. I mean, it was such a simple question, and not only a simple question, but one that she's had to address multiple times. She should know how to answer it. But instead you get, hey, you think maybe you could have made this whole thing easier by just defining Islamophobia? Oh, any other questions? Well, why don't you answer that one? Oh, well, it was a collaborative effort, and boy, oh boy, am I ever looking forward to that study. God damn. When's the last time you ever heard an honest person dodge a question that blatantly and repeatedly? The answer's never. She sounds just like the Heritage Minister Melanie Joly, in fact, from my video about her interview about the motion. When people do that, it just makes me instantly suspicious of their motives. Especially because these questions are so simple, and they've heard them so many times by now. It would be so easy for any honest person to answer clearly and concisely. And as a matter of fact, it'd be easy for any competent, dishonest person to do that too. So I'm really curious to see what these clowns get up to next, especially once that Sharia petition is done. But something you can do next, if you like my channel, is support me on Patreon. And if you want to see more videos, subscribe and thumb up this video. And if you find any crazy videos or articles that you'd like me to take a look at, then make sure to tweet them to me. I can always use new material. And I'll see you next time.